Welcome to Polaris Live. This is Sarwar Kashmeri inviting our viewers from around the world to this series of programs on the United States and China in the world. This program is brought to you live in conjunction with the Foreign Policy Association in New York. Polaris Live is now in its third year of operation, and I want to thank our global readership for your confidence in our unbiased coverage of the most consequential relationship of our time and its impact in the world. My guest today is Mr. Shehzad Qazi. He is the managing director of China Beige Book International. He is the firm-wide operations lead at China Beige Book, where he oversees corporate strategy and product innovation. Shehzad is a frequent guest on major national news networks, including CNBC, Bloomberg, CNN, speaks regularly at investor conferences. He is a non-resident fellow at the Center for Global Policy. Please welcome to Polaris Live, Mr. Shehzad Qazi. Good morning, Shehzad.
Good morning. Good to see you.
How are you today in the capital of the world?
Doing quite well.
Many thanks for joining us, Shehzad. It's a fortuitous time to have you on PolarisLive.com. But, before we start getting your thoughts about the prospect of China's economic growth, I wonder if there's a simple way for you to explain to our audience that is not a specialist in economics and bring everyone on the same page by explaining that unlike most countries that count their services and manufacture and come out with a gross domestic product GDP number at the end of the year, China does the opposite. It sets a number and says, we want to grow at this number. And then people in the provinces, hinterland, have to meet that number. Can you just explain that and the difference it makes for people who are not economists, please?
Yeah, happy to do so. The first thing is, for the longest time, there was a lot of obsession and focus on the Chinese GDP because of the high rate of growth. When China was growing at a double-digit pace, it then slowed down to somewhere around 8%, and then slowed down subsequently since then. But the China growth story has been wrapped around the idea of this exponential speed with which the economy has expanded. Now, as you correctly said, in China, GDP accounting takes a very different form, and for folks, so basically, essentially, has remnants of the planned economy tied into it. Where at the beginning of the year, the government sets a target. That target is then passed down to different provinces who have targets of their own to hit. And the idea is that at the end of the year, we would have accomplished, in this particular case for 2023, 5% growth. In years prior, numbers that were higher than that. Now, what happens as a result of that is that you have provinces and local governments undertaking economic activity, providing credit to firms to undertake economic activity that can just help them hit the target. So if you have to dig a hole and fill it back up, build a bridge, whether or not you need a bridge, sell a whole bunch of land to developers to erect apartment buildings that nobody may ever actually live in, you do all of that because all of that counts towards the GDP. The downside of this approach, so whereas for years and years, this approach was one that made investors a lot of money, and it of course is part and parcel of the China growth miracle, and it certainly lifted lots of people out of poverty. What it did over time, of course, is create very serious problems in the Chinese economy of over-indebtedness, companies that are over-leveraged, over-capacity. And of course, the real estate bubble that ultimately got created is part and parcel of all of this. Local governments being heavily indebted now is part and parcel of all of this. So what this has done, I can summarize my views this way, is created a lot of aggregate growth the way GDP does, but not necessarily created a lot of productive growth. And it has saddled the economy with a lot of problems. And now as the party thinks about redoing the economic model, changing the economic model, it needs to deal with a whole lot of structural problems that have been created as a result of the way it has gone about planning the economy and hitting these GDP targets.
That's so interesting. You've explained it so clearly for people, as I say, who are not economists. And I'm just surprised that this particular this particular way of counting GDP has not gotten more daylight than it has. Because I noticed in the Financial Times this morning, as you pointed out, Shehzad, that the real estate transactions are heavily financed by local governments. And they pointed out today in the Financial Times that because of the revenue shortfall, the local governments are boosting their revenue by selling land to their own entities. And this is part of what you're talking about, right?
Yeah. That's exactly it. For the longest time, local governments, because they lack the ability to tax and spend on their own, have been reliant on selling on essentially, I guess, 99-year leases or whatever land that of course the government owned from given the communist structure that you had there, especially in the rural areas. And that has led to all sorts of problems, not only the displacement of farmers and the displacement of the rural poor, but it has, of course, created this problem where the incentive structure has been aligned towards selling as much land as possible to developers, who are then taking on as many loans as they can possibly get from state banks at the local level, who are ordered to lend to the developers and erect these buildings, and this has been happening year over year over year, and then led to, of course, the big property market bubble that the government has been trying to deflate for the last couple of years, roughly.
So how does one then compare China's economic performance, Shehzad, to America's or Japan's? I mean, we always do this comparison, right? So China's getting to be the second largest economy, soon to be the largest economy. How does one do that?
Yeah, that's exactly the problem. That China's economy and that level is not directly comparable, because we don't know how much of it is actually what proportion of that GDP every year is coming from productive sources, and sources which will actually make the Chinese economy grow at a sustainable pace into the future. As a matter of fact, this leads us right back to the thing we've talked about in the past, which is that China's economy is now facing serious amounts of structural problems. There is a desire within the party now to alter the growth model. But regardless of whether the party is able to successfully transition the economy from this industrial and industry-driven model and high debt and high investment model to one that is grows at a more sustainable and healthier pace, and is driven by domestic consumption, therefore, that question aside, the point is that China's economy now is going to slow down. The structural slowdown is almost guaranteed, which means that this long-term obsession with whether China will overshoot the United States or be on par, etc., those are still very much open questions.
Do you think that, in view of what you've just said, that it is going to be even more difficult to narrow the richness gap, if I may call it that, because the Chinese cities and so on, Shenzhen, etc., Shanghai, have grown at the huge rates, whereas the inside has not, and China's tried very hard to equalize the wage gap. So I have two questions. One, do you think it'll make it harder? And do you think that China will clamp down some more, as some people say they're doing already, on their very rich billionaire folks who've created a lot of this capitalist economy?
Yeah, I think the first thing is that we're hearing a lot about common prosperity again, but the
Yes.
overall attitude still is towards companies providing charitable donations. That is the model for now, that they're putting money voluntarily themselves. There hasn't been announced any type of serious regulatory shakeup to create a taxation system around corporate taxes and income taxes and redoing whatever exists today in order for the state to then go in and continue to invest and expand in its social welfare system. I mean, the biggest irony, of course, is that China has this communist legacy, but China at the same time has an essentially non-existent social safety net. You have a system where the young folks in the family are responsible for caring for their parents when they get old, and oftentimes caring for their grandparents when they get old. So families in Chinese households are essentially responsible for themselves. There is no social security and Medicaid and that sort of stuff that's out there. Things that we in the United States now, or especially in Western Europe, see as an integral component of any state, the welfare component, the social safety net component. So a lot more work probably needs to be done there. But for the time being, what you are seeing, and this is where political motivations get into play, is certainly the billionaire class, people who also stand to potentially threaten the party's control, being told that they must start contributing on their own, because we need to have prosperity across the board.
Right. But you've made an interesting point that in China, the grandparents and parents, families take care of them. In view of that, we tend to forget that, Shehzad, I think, because we always talk about the demographic problem in China, right? And so is the demographic problem not as serious because of what you just said? Is because, people take care of their own?
No, the demographic problem actually is very, very serious, and the party is actually very concerned about the demographic problem. One of the things. So let's take a step back. Of course, we all know the relaxation of the one-child policy that has taken place. There is increasingly a desire to incentivize families to not only have 2 children, but perhaps even have 3 children, because the labor market participation, the labor force participation in that country is ultimately going to start dropping, and dropping quite seriously. And whereas the long-term demographic trends may not be reversible, there is a desire to have some remedial policies in place. But if you look at what is going on, for example, with the property market, a lot of the deflation of the property market, the desire to take on this bubble, or a good chunk of it, was also driven by the fact that property prices had become so insanely expensive and high that you couldn't have an average Chinese family buy apartments, buy houses. That has a twofold effect. Number one, and culturally, it's a place where before you marry somebody, and if you're a man, you should own property. Well, if you don't own property, your marriage prospects are hurt by that. If your marriage prospects are hurt, you're not going to be creating the families and the children that the party needs you to create. Well, that's one aspect of it. The second aspect of it, of course, is also that families cannot grow if property prices are really expensive. If you look at what happened to the edtech sector, education had become so expensive that families again were disincentivized from having more than one child. So they've taken on and basically destroyed the edtech sector to bring the cost of education down. So a lot of the regulatory policies, which have had very serious ramifications for global investors in China, actually are part and parcel of this big rooted concern about demographics.
It's so interesting what you've just said, Shehzad, because Sean Whitejian, who we've interviewed on this program more than once, he runs one of Asia's most influential asset management firms. He told the Harvard Business Review not too long ago, when they asked him, what do you think the Chinese don't understand very well about America? And he said how socialist America really is, because, they have tax on dividends, they have tax on this as to support their whole family. And they said, what do you think the Americans don't understand about the Chinese? And they said how capitalist China really is. So it's so interesting when you get into this, how it works. But allow me, if you will, Shehzad, to remind our viewers to be sure and sign up for Polaris Live alerts on our upcoming programs by going to my website, kashmeri.com. It's Kashmeri. You may also want to subscribe to our YouTube channel to establish a closer connection with our studio staff. There's no cost, but it really helps us. And now back to my guest, Mr. Shehzad Qazi, Managing Director of China Beige Book, and he's talking about China's economy and its recovery post the zero COVID policy in China. Let me switch to the U.S. financial sanctions on China, if you will, Shehzad. U.S. Chamber of Commerce and other business groups maintain they have mainly only hurt Americans. Trade continues to grow, the budget surplus continues to increase. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, the fact right now is that there is a consensus in Washington around the fact that the relationship with China has not worked out as it was initially envisioned, even promised. That China has, of course, not lived up to its WTO commitments. That American corporations, as a matter of fact, which today perhaps are seen as Beijing's best friends in Washington, were just a few years ago themselves, going up to American policymakers and lawmakers and saying, you must press China harder to meet its WTO commitments in terms of giving us greater market access, cutting back on subsidies to domestic rivals of ours over there, intellectual property theft, and forced technology transfer, all of which remain very serious issues. So a lot of the trade policy thinking that we saw under Donald Trump, of course, is the idea that trade policy has not worked out for us. And we all know the issues of hollowing out of American communities, the destruction of the labor force here, and then all the issues that have developed, which are domestic policy issues, but certainly not de-linked, as a matter of fact, catalyzed by America's trade policy vis-a-vis China and perhaps even elsewhere. So that is the thinking here. Now, we all understand what the consensus in DC is. What is people a lot less sure about is what to do about it. How do you solve this problem? The tariffs are too politically sensitive to be taken off. So the tariffs are going to be here to stay for a while. And it may be that subsequent administrations tweak that policy around. But, the search certainly should be and is in certain quarters in Washington among the lawmakers and so forth about how to better address the various challenges that have emerged. And I think we're just at the very beginning of this long process.
Let me ask you, one of the things you've mentioned that China not living up to its WTO agreements to open up its economy. But isn't it true, Shehzad, that in the financial sector, that is indeed the case, that they've opened up very rapidly? We reviewed a book last week on Polaris Live, in which the story was about an American group taking over a Chinese bank, the Shenzhen Development Bank, which was belly up basically, and then buying full ownership of it. So an American group buying ownership of a Chinese bank, turning it around, making money for their investors, and then giving it back or selling it back to the Chinese government, the local government in this case. So my question is, you have Morgan Bank, you have Goldman Sachs, you have HSB lining up to open in China because now they can have majority shareholding. So isn't it true that on the financial side, perhaps that the WTO is still working in China, but it's on the other different issues, the manufacturing and so on, the way it's not? Any thoughts on that?
So the opening for American banks that took place, as of course we know, happened in the aftermath of the Trump tariffs, right? So it was when the Trump administration levied a series of phase 1, phase 2 tariffs onto the incoming Chinese goods, and subsequently there was some negotiation that was carried out. Well, one of the things that the Trump administration was able to finally secure was greater market share for American banks, Wall Street banks, and their ability to have this majority ownership of entities inside China, which of course folks on the policy circle in the policy world have and outside have very concerns about, that should the American government be negotiating on behalf of particular Chinese companies in that format, or American financial institutions, number one, but more importantly, the message it reinforced actually was that it took the tariffs and it took a hardline sticks approach in order to finally win some kind of concession. So it doesn't exactly reinforce a positive message because of the way this all came about, of course.
Well, that's so interesting because Mr. Trump took a lot of hits on his policies. But in this particular case, you're pointing out that they may actually have benefited. So a related question, of course, has to do with this disconnection of the economies. There's a lot of talk about that. And do you think it's really possible in this world, in the 21st century, to totally disentangle the economies of the two largest countries, two largest economies in the world?
It's, well, I suppose anything's possible in theory, but I think practically speaking, complete decoupling is, I don't think, intended, and probably very, very, very difficult to achieve. What it seems like we're going to most likely get over time, and this is going to be a very messy process and is going to create a lot of uncertainty for investors and American corporations more specifically, and other foreign corporations, is a process of selective decoupling. So probably a push which says that as far as critical goods are concerned, such as pharmaceuticals, such as critical minerals, such as other inputs that the military perhaps uses, that China can no longer be, and Chinese entities rather, can no longer be part of the supply chain for this subset of critical materials and critical inputs. There may be financial decoupling in the sense which says that, look, the money of American pension funds or the American households in general cannot be invested into Chinese companies that are working with the Chinese military or have a dual use function, are the part of the national security establishment in China. You will similarly get selective decoupling on the technology side, which says that as far as goods are concerned, which can be used both for military purposes and civilian purposes, well, we need to be careful about what China has access to because of the military usage. So I think the most realistic outcome eventually, if that direction is successful, and that's also a big if in and of itself, we're at the very beginning of these stages, will be the attempt to do selective decoupling. But therein, certainly from a business standpoint, if you're an investor, if you're a corporate decision maker, you're looking at a lot of uncertainty ahead, and you're looking at a lot of risk planning and getting serious about that ahead now.
But Shehzad, what do you then tell the people who are against a lot of this decoupling perspective, who say that, look, all you're going to do is force China to develop their own technologies because they're full of scientists and STEM people, science, engineering, and so on. So in time, they will have it anyway. So why not improve our relations, which are at daggers drawn right now, and think sensibly about what we should do and not do?
The fact is that China's desire to develop and become a technologically sophisticated manufacturer, as a matter of fact, a manufacturer of technologically and high-end technologies, or technologies that will ultimately provide critical inputs into high-end manufacturing, that's already a goal that the party has laid out, not from now, but from a long time ago. As a matter of fact, Made in China 2025, which predates any type of American tightening of economic policy towards China, was meant to do exactly that. And Made in China 2025, it very much exists today, even though it may not exist as a slogan anymore. So that policy that's a secular trend that's going to happen regardless of what the U.S. does or does not do. The real question, I think, boils down to, and this is where a lot of the policy conversation may be confused, is that the concerns ultimately from the national security standpoint are that, is the U.S. going to ultimately be handing over to China technology that the military plans to already in China use in order to gain a superior position, right? In order to gain a further superior position in the South China Sea, in other parts of the world, in order to perhaps one day attack Taiwan, in order to become a real a bigger military threat to the United States. The context, of course, is that we've seen a rapid modernization and expansion of the Chinese military, and of course, a rather stepped up, an aggressive posture within the Asia Pacific. So that's the context, and I think that's where the concern is coming from. I have no doubt in my mind that these policies will perhaps only delay, but not derail, China's ability to achieve its technological, goals.
I'm smiling, Shehzad, because what you have just said reminded me of this front page article in the Wall Street Journal 2 or 3 days ago that basically said the American military over the last few years has totally failed to develop a modern way of war fighting. That China is so far ahead with the hundreds and hundreds of missiles with which it could swamp our bases and our allies in the Pacific, and that now we need to wholesale redesign so in a sense, the shoe's on the other foot, isn't it?
Yeah, that's certainly true, right? We just spent the last 20 years of the United States spent the last 20 years fighting what many would call unnecessary wars, and trillions and trillions of dollars, and not terrible much to show for it. If you look at what happened in Afghanistan, and of course Iraq remains a mess, the Middle East writ large, and it gave China a brilliant advantage to advance its and to wait it out. And now, of course, American inventory and supplies are getting drawn down because of the war in Europe, with Ukraine getting supplied with American inventory. So the United States military position in many ways is actually far more concerning than people realize.
Yes, it reminds me a little bit about, remember the time in India when there were no cell phones, and it used to take 8 years to get a telephone, and people said, well, we can never have as many switchboards to wire all of India, and then the cell phones came and knocked out that whole model. That's what seems to be happening to the United States on the military side. But in the few minutes we have remaining, I just want to touch on manufacturing. Is that a picture that's improving in China? Because I know that's a large part of this GDP economic picture. Is that manufacturing getting back into gear, Shehzad?
There's some amounts of improvement that took place in the month of February, but single month statistics are so misleading oftentimes. I think this year manufacturing will probably remain under pressure, especially because of the recessionary fears, and largely because of the recessionary fears in the United States and Europe. So as we get closer and closer to the economy slowing down, remembering that our manufacturing sector here in the United States is already in a recession if you look at the data that come out here. So I am not particularly optimistic about how well manufacturing will do in China, which is why the bulk of the focus is now on how soon do you get an organic recovery by the households in China? Does the property market find a footing? And if none of that seems to be taking place, well, then how soon does the government resort to more traditional methods of reviving the economy through fiscal stimulus and other forms of monetary policy easing?
And finally, before we really run out of time, I want to ask you there's a thinking that we got caught flat-footed when this manufacturing and so on got transmitted over to Asia, especially to China. That the government should have thought ahead and set up policies to help people who were getting displaced. Right? Do you think the same thing is happening now as we transition to a giga-economy? They say cars, the heavy manufacturing is going to disappear. There'll be electric cars. Do you think we ought not to make the same mistake again, and government should think a step ahead?
There's no question about that, right? Businesses and business trade groups got to set trade policy in the 90s, which of course meant that, these companies were able to have spectacular profits, and the American stock market, as a result of that, of course, saw a spectacular run, which means that the gains accumulated to those with capital, those at the very top, and workers and communities, as you just mentioned, were on the losing end of it because there were no real trade adjustment policies put into effect. Automation, as you're saying very correctly, is now going to have a similar result, which is why, alongside worrying about China, I think the lawmakers in Washington, D.C. would be best served if they thought and figured more, what should be done to revitalize the American labor market and the American workforce so that the American workforce is equipped for, 2035 and 2045 and not just 2025.
Well, Mr. Shehzad Qazi, you and I could go on forever. I learned so much. I'm sure our audience does with you, but we have now run out of time. And before our producer knocks me on the head, I want to thank you for being our guest, and I hope you will come back and visit us.
Thank you so much for having me back. It's always a pleasure.
And I want to thank our viewers now from around the world for supporting us. And I hope you can join us again for the next episode on Polaris Live, on which we will have an expert on business law in China to give you some idea of how China's law is changing and interpret it for all of us. So until we see you again on Polaris Live, this is Sarwar Kashmeri. Goodbye.